The Bible is filled with mysterious miracles, but what if there's a logical explanation behind it all? From parting waters to astronomical phenomena, these are the biblical stories that got things, surprisingly, right. When it comes to the overall structure of Earth, a handful of Bible verses get things basically correct. For example, Isaiah chapter 40 verse 22 describes the Earth as a circle, which perhaps isn't that surprising when you learn that Greek writers by 500 BC had generally agreed that our planet was a sphere. Meanwhile, Job chapter 26 verse 7 notes that Earth is in space, unsupported by any structure, which sounds like the gravity-based balance of the planet and the rest of the solar system in the near-total vacuum of space. And Job 28 verse 5 states, "As for the earth, out of it cometh bread, and under it is turned up as it were fire." This image isn't too far off from what we understand of Earth's geology today. Modern measurements of seismic waves indicate a solid inner core and liquid outer core and mantle, all of which are at seriously hot temperatures. In the very first verses of the Bible, the earth is not yet fully formed. Instead, according to Genesis chapter 1, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." To some readers, this suggests a watery, primordial existence, and that matches up closely with studies of the environment of early Earth. A 2020 paper published in Nature Geoscience outlined research that examined ancient seawater sediments and oxygen isotopes. Changes in the composition of these sediments indicate that true continents didn't begin to emerge from the ocean until somewhere between 3 and 2.5 billion years ago, well after Earth's formation 4.5 billion years ago. This global ocean would have had a dramatic effect on the environment and the emergence of life at the time. And a 2021 study in AGU Advances further supports this idea, with information that the planet's oceans were once as much as twice the size of today's water cover and could have flooded the vast majority of the planet. The water cycle may seem like a basic scientific theory that you learned about in high school, but in case you need a refresher, water evaporates up into the atmosphere and falls back down as precipitation and exists throughout the Earth as ice, groundwater, rivers, and more.
It's gonna rain!
Some Bible verses appear to indicate that ancient writers had a handle on the water cycle long before modern science came along. Job chapter 36 gives the Almighty credit for creating rain-producing clouds, while Ecclesiastes chapter 1 notes that all rivers eventually make their way to the sea, but given that the ocean isn't completely full, water must return somehow back to the river's source. Maybe this knowledge isn't all that surprising when you consider how central water-consuming agriculture would have been to humanity at the time that these books were written. Furthermore, ancient Greek and Chinese writers were discussing similar concepts at the same time. Germ theory is fairly basic and not controversial nowadays, but it wasn't always that way. Various scientists and public health officials over the centuries proposed the idea, but it wasn't until the late 19th century that the idea that small, practically invisible organisms could cause illness started to become widely accepted, thanks to the work of scientists like Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur. Nevertheless, people who lived long before that era generally knew that filth was linked to illness, and that's clear when you read the Old Testament. In Leviticus chapter 11, for example, believers are instructed to carefully clean their clothes after handling dead animals.
Stay away from squiggly worms. They're full of dirt and yucky germs.
And Leviticus chapter 13 offers highly detailed directions for dealing with people who have skin lesions, with a priest determining if it's contagious leprosy and ordering quarantine if necessary. Other verses provide instructions for cleaning infected clothes, while Deuteronomy chapter 23 instructs people answering the call of nature outdoors to dig a hole for their waste. There's no evidence of a historical global flood on par with that described in the story of Noah's Ark. There simply wasn't enough water on the planet then or now to submerge everything. It would at most cover the planet with mere inches of water. But if you interpret this tale according to the theory that the flood was merely a large-scale regional event, then there is scientific evidence backing it up. A 2009 study published in Quaternary Science Reviews presented evidence of a massive flood in a geological basin in the Black Sea region around 9,400 years ago. Oceanographer Robert Ballard, who's famous for discovering the wreck of the Titanic, has supported this theory while conducting underwater archaeological research off the Turkish coast in 2012. His team found evidence of a shoreline that could have been suddenly and dramatically submerged about 5,000 years ago. As he told ABC News, "It probably was a bad day. At some magic moment, it broke through and flooded this place violently, and a lot of real estate, 150,000 square kilometers of land, went under." In Genesis chapter 19, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed by a rain of fire and brimstone. Some scholars have suggested that these cities were part of a region near the Dead Sea that is now partially submerged after a major earthquake shook the region nearly 4,000 years ago. Released gases in the area may have ignited and contributed to the fiery image of the city's destruction. Other scholars have linked these cities to the site of Tal el-Hammam, which was destroyed around 1650 BC. This mysterious event appears to have brought intensely high heat down upon the city, to the point that pottery began to melt on the outside, while remaining untouched inside. Meanwhile, structures like towers and five-story buildings were devastated by the impact and the heat. The authors of a study published in 2021 in the journal Scientific Reports suggest that an impact event involving an astronomical body like a comet could have produced an appropriately intense shockwave and firestorm. Furthermore, it could have melted mud bricks, produced tiny diamond-like structures, and practically vaporized any humans or animals who were unfortunate enough to be in the path of destruction. In the Gospel of Matthew's account of Jesus' crucifixion, an earthquake shakes the region. Resurrection from the dead may not be supported by any actual historical account, but there may be some truth to this portentous tremor, at least according to a 2012 paper published in International Geology Review. The research specifically looks at the report from the Gospel and compares it to sediment analysis from the region.
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Deformations in these deposits indicate that a major earthquake really did happen in the region around Jerusalem and the Dead Sea in the 1st century, most likely in the years between AD 26 and 36. This is pretty close to the time that most scholars agreed that Jesus died. However, it's worth noting that precisely dating earthquakes is very difficult and comes with a years-wide margin of error. The study authors specifically state that their estimation should come with a 5-year margin on either side of AD 31. After the death of Moses, Joshua succeeded him as the leader of the Israelites. He conquered the rival Canaanites and finally led them to the long-awaited Promised Land. And the book of Joshua contains an odd little detail that might surprisingly not be so far from scientific truth. Specifically, in chapter 10, verses 12 and 13, Joshua says, "Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ailon." The heavenly bodies do as they're told, demonstrating the power of God and Joshua's special connection with the divine. These verses might also indicate a historic solar eclipse. As described in a 2017 issue of the journal Astronomy and Geophysics, the account in Joshua appears to describe a known solar eclipse that likely happened on October 30th, 1207 BC. The paper's authors argue that the 17th century King James translation didn't get the original Hebrew quite right when it said that the sun and moon stopped moving. Instead, their interpretation is that they merely stopped shining as normal. The event would have been an annular eclipse, in which the moon doesn't fully block the sun, but instead leaves a small ring of light around it at the height of the eclipse. The area in its path below would then have levels of light equivalent to dusk. There's a lot about the story of Noah's Ark that doesn't make sense from a scientific perspective. For one thing, the Ark itself is meant to be a massive structure that can withstand a powerful storm that drowned most of life on Earth, while also safely holding at least 2 of every animal species. As recounted in the book of Genesis chapter 6, God delivers instructions about the kind of wood to use, how to seal it, the dimensions of the Ark, and where to place a window and door in the structure. It ultimately works out to being over 500 feet long, which might sound basically impossible, but perhaps it's not as far off from reality as you might think. In 2013, students at the University of Leicester calculated that the Ark could have been the right size to both stay afloat and contain a weight equivalent to 2.15 million sheep, which were used as a handy stand-in for the average weight of all of the animals.
We'll see what we can do for you.
Moses is considered one of the most important prophets of the Bible and a vital leader of the ancient Hebrew people. But he wasn't always taken so seriously. When attempting to get the Egyptian Pharaoh to release the Israelites from slavery, he forced his hand with a series of plagues. According to Exodus chapter 7, those plagues included water turning to blood, frogs, lice, flies, ill livestock, skin lesions, hail, darkness, and the death of all non-Hebrew firstborn children. The biblical account attributes all of this to divine intervention. But there is a possible scientific explanation for all of these disasters. If we accept the traditional assumption that Ramses II was the Egyptian pharaoh in this story, then it's interesting to note that an extended drought actually took place during his reign in the 13th century BC. This could have allowed toxic red-tinged algae to bloom in the Nile, killing fish, increasing pest populations, and allowing for disease to spread. As for the hail and darkness, some scholars point to a sandstorm that may have swept over the region. Others suggest that a massive volcanic eruption on Greece's island of Santorini released ash high enough into the atmosphere to block the sun, and that this may well have been observable in Egypt. This eruption may have occurred centuries before Ramses' time, but perhaps later writers conflated these disasters. Another well-known story from Exodus happens when Moses finally convinces the Pharaoh to release the Israelites from servitude. But while they're making their way out of Egyptian territory, the Pharaoh changes his mind and orders his forces to pursue them, trapping them on the shore of a sea. Moses then miraculously parts the waters so that the Israelites can walk forth. The Egyptians follow, but then with another wave of Moses' hand, the waters swallow them up. This might sound like a miracle that is beyond any scientific explanation, yet it could have really happened if the environmental conditions were right. According to a 2010 paper in the journal PLOS ONE, if Moses and his followers were crossing the right point in the Red Sea, a phenomenon known as wind set-down may have happened, in which high winds push back water and expose previously submerged land. Perhaps a mistranslation meant that what we thought was the Red Sea was actually a shallower sea of reeds, which would have been easier to navigate with the help of wind set-down. This isn't exactly definitive proof of such an event happening, but if you're looking for something beyond a religious explanation, then the scientific link remains compelling.